Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar celebrating 10 years of the journal Health Policy and Technology. My name is Dwayne Schultes. I'm the Managing Director of Vital Transformation. And today I'll be moderating this webinar discussing vaccines, trusted information, and fake news. Thank you very much for being with us today. If you're having internet connection issues, we have provided several dozen toll-free phone numbers for you. On the menu button, you have a little mute, little signal there. You have a little arrow. Go ahead and push the arrow. This menu will pop up. You can switch to the phone if you're having connectivity issues. And again, we absolutely want your participation. We've had over 100 registrations for this webinar. Thank you. And we do want your questions. We want your interaction. So please, and you'll see the little Q&A button on your menu. Go ahead and push that. This menu pops up and you can submit your questions to us, which we will take and filter through the webinar as we proceed. So within many countries, the COVID-19 pandemic is entering a third wave, and vaccine confidence is a live issue. According to an August 2018 edition of The Economist, Italy, France, and Serbia have lower child vaccination rates than Burundi, Rwanda, and Senegal. Given the contradictory messaging regarding vaccine safety by many politicians, Belgium at one point in 2021 had received 200,000 units of the AstraZeneca vaccine, but had only been able to distribute 4% of that quantity due to a lack of acceptance by the general public. In contrast, the WHO notes that 65% of the population in less developed countries are willing to accept the vaccines, according to their recent surveys. So how do we ensure that valid information regarding vaccines is circulated and accepted at all levels of society, both in developed and in less developed cultures? How do we disentangle our outright vaccination refusal from vaccine hesitancy? And how do we determine what is real versus fake news? And today I'm joined by an exceptional panel of speakers that I'd like to introduce you to now. First, let me introduce you to Isabelle Manet, the vaccine coordinator for the European Patient Forum. Isabelle, thank you for joining us today. How are you?
I'm very good. I'm very happy and pleased to be here with you.
Thank you very much, Isabelle. We're also joined by Wilfred Riley, who's the Assistant Professor of Political Science, one of the U.S.'s most noted political scientists now from Kentucky State University. Wilfred, always a pleasure to see you, sir. How are you?
Doing well. Thanks for having me on. Great to be
here. Thank you, Wilfred. It's always a pleasure. We're also joined by Franco Carpuccio from Warwick University, who's going to be presenting a paper on non-scientific threats to public health policies, but he's agreed to participate in this discussion today. Hello, Franco. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
And unfortunately, we were going to be joined by Simon Piatek from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine from the Vaccine Confidence Project. Unfortunately, he's dealing with a family issue, but I'm also joined by my colleague in this series, Dr. Donald Singer, who's the president of the Fellowship of Postgraduate Medicine, and Donald will also be contributing to this discussion. Thank you, Donald. And Donald, I understand you want to do a little introduction about the journal. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dwayne, and delighted to have our distinguished panel on board and to have our delegates from around the world joining us for this session. What I want to do is say a little bit about our journal before we kick off with the topic for this particular session, which is one of 5 to mark the 10th anniversary of the journal. I'd like to share my screen briefly. So here you can see our journal, which is owned by a medical society, the Fellowship of Postgraduate Medicine, of which I am the president. We've been around since 1918. The journal was set up in 2012, and it deals with the spectrum from drugs to devices and diagnostics, clinical trials, ethics, e-health, and supporting technologies. And the aim is to make information updates available to practitioners, to academics, as well as to our health policy leaders. And just very briefly, here you can see some of the topics coming up in future sessions, including AI, equity outcomes, geopolitical challenges, and very topical climate and health. I think without more ado, Dwayne, what I should do, I think, is as Simon can't join us, I think it'd be useful just to talk briefly about some aspects of the virus and why we should be so worried about vaccines and fake news.
Please, Donald, the floor is yours.
So I think it's worth stressing the point, COVID-19, it's been around probably at least since November 2019, first really as a respiratory disease, but it's a real concern because it's global, it can be fatal, there's lots of high-risk groups, and although first of all people thought it was predominantly respiratory, it can affect many parts of the body, both as a short-term illness, but also as long-term disease, now known widely as long COVID. And in some examples, we know that there could be scarring of the lungs, giving rise to risk of recurrent infection and breathlessness, inability to be as active as people want to be. There are also some neuropsychiatric issues. Perhaps 1 in 4 people initially have some serious symptoms. This is partly due to the inflammatory factors released by the virus, partly due to low blood oxygen, but also due to other effects of the virus on the brain. Maybe just to illustrate that, just 1 or 2 slides. What we know is that if I show you some scans, these look very complicated, but just illustrates 2 sides of this virus. In acute illness, this top is a section, a scan through the chest. What you're seeing here are muscles. Here's the back of the body, front of the body. The top left image, you can see that there's, in the center, there's an area which is has white circles in that. These are the blood vessels. And then around the outside, you can see a rather gray area. Now, the top 2 panels are showing you a lot of scarring in one of the lungs. But where you can see the blue arrows in the bottom, this is showing you differences in the grayness in the blood vessels. Here's a big blood vessel across the center of the heart. And the lighter gray is showing you a big blood clot. And this illustrates the fact that the virus can cause clotting in the veins and the arteries. This can cause unexpectedly worse lung damage beyond caused by the infection. It can also cause problems in the blood vessels. Now, there are 2 sides to this which should make us worry particularly. We know that worldwide we've got epidemics of a whole range of risk factors which give rise to more heart disease and strokes. We'll hear more about that from Professor Cappuccio. But all these groups are more at risk of getting infection with the virus, people with high blood pressure, heart disease, diabetes, obesity, as well as the elderly. On top of that, if you look at some of the early reports, we know that people who had the virus were more likely to have disorders in the circulation themselves. So just to give an example, here we've got a report in the bottom from New York City, almost 6,000 patients, and many of these had high blood pressure, obesity, many more than you expect from the general population. If you look at the bottom of this panel here, what you can see is in a big study from China, 45,000 patients, there were 1,000 deaths. That's clearly very worrying. But if you look at other aspects, although you would expect there to be some heart disease, some risk factors in the population, generally, roughly 5 times more people who died from the virus actually had a background of heart disease. We're also very worried about the virus being high risk in a whole range of ethnic minority groups. Reasons aren't clear for that. That includes increased cardiovascular risk factors, maybe other cultural factors. These are people vulnerable if they're not protected in some way by public health measures, including vaccination. If you look at the heart itself, it turns out that the virus itself can cause serious heart damage to heart muscle. If patients don't die from this, and they may do so through heart attacks and heart failure, they may go on to have severe shortness of breath in the long term due to heart disease as well as lung disease. Now, just to finish with two very topical slides on where we're at. Well, here's an example from a small country, from Scotland. And what you can see is that in Scotland, on the left-hand side, you can see the number of cases from 1st of May to 1st July. On the right, the number of people in hospital. And you can see that numbers have been going up over the last 3 months. And there was an initial surge as schools closed, more people were at home, more people in the community. But you can see that in a country where there's a strong public health approach combined with double vaccination in many people, the number of cases is going down despite wider mixing in the community of young people. And that's been matched by a falling in hospitalization rates. So the message there is that with strong public health approach, including double vaccination, we're able to turn the corner. And if you look at my last slide of where we're at the moment, oops, here we go. This is taken from Bloomberg, the vaccine tracker, data up to July the 23rd, so very topical, 4 days old. Now, this green scale is showing you how we're getting on around the world with getting uptake of double vaccination. And the darker the green, the closer we are to getting 3/4 of the population, which is one marker of trying to get enough immunity in the population to protect those who are more vulnerable, those who have not been vaccinated. So the countries with the darker green are only 2 months away from reaching this really important public health target. But many countries are into the larger areas you can see in the southern US states, are perhaps 18 months away from this kind of protection, and in parts of Africa and Asia, perhaps even further away than that. So just to sum up this very brief run through, here's a vaccine. We have many examples available to protect us from disease. Here's a disease around for the last 15 to 18 months with more information available. We're able to vaccinate, but there are major differences around the world in uptake and major consent. And today's webinar really from now is to consider why is there such a difference across countries? It's not just economic. What can we do about it, addressing this and protecting our populations?
Thank you very much, Donald. And just so everyone knows, Donald prepared that in about 10 minutes. So it's really great for you to come in and pinch hit like that, Donald. Really appreciate that. So that sets the state of play, and that gives us sort of an idea of what we're dealing with. Now, Isabel, from your perspective at the European Patient Forum, you folks have been working a lot with a lot of the governments to try and make sure that we're getting the right information to patients. Can you just tell us a bit of what you've been doing and how that's been going? Thank you.
Exactly. So I'd like to do just a little bit of a background information. I'm actually a registered pharmacist and a certified public health professional. But today I'll be introducing the problem statement from a chronic disease patient perspective to you. So chronic diseases affect more than 80% of people aged over 65 in Europe and account for up to 80% of healthcare costs in terms of premature deaths, healthy life years lost, and loss of productivity. So now it's estimated that almost 50 million people live with multiple chronic diseases and accordingly are contributing to the main challenge facing Europe's healthcare in providing equitable access to high quality care that is patient-centric and meets people's changing needs. Evidence shows that chronic diseases can increase the risk of serious complications from certain vaccine preventable diseases. And epidemiological studies confirm that comprehensive vaccination programs are the cornerstone of good public health and brings about lifelong societal benefits. However, sustainable investment in improving dialogue with citizens, listening to their needs, understanding their concerns, and developing tailored intervention strategies is still required. So because of gaps in vaccination uptake among patients and the flooding of information through websites, online information, and as such, and the importance of the risks to patients with chronic conditions that they face from vaccine preventable diseases, EPF started an initiative in 2018 in providing trusted information and supporting patient organizations' advocacy on the importance of vaccination. We initially started this by surveying our members on this topic in 2018 to get a clear picture of the needs and gaps in the patient community. And accordingly, we developed several information resources, including leaflets, brochures for chronic disease patients, supporting the advocacy efforts of national patient groups on vaccination. Later on, we held a pilot workshop with a patient community in Romania, which took place in Bucharest as well the same year. And this was done in collaboration with our Romanian member organization, COPAC. In 2019, we continued on working on this very important topic through the development of a patient guide to vaccination. And this was in fact launched in the beginning of this year. It's a concise, portable information tool that expands and goes beyond information already available in fact sheet format. It also covers at the same time ways of how you can discuss with other people that are naysayers or maybe not vaccine supporters of how to maybe take into consideration other sources of and more trusted information. We also prepared a policy brief for members to give comprehensive overview of ongoing EU level activities and initiatives. and held 2 more national workshops, one in Cluj, Romania, and another workshop in Cologne, Germany. So overall 3 workshops. In 2020, here we come to the more current part, the European Union Backpack Pilot Project was launched, led by EPF. So it's a service contract under European Commission DG Sante. The project focuses on the importance of a life course approach to vaccination for patients with chronic diseases. The project was launched even before COVID-19 had hit Europe. Accordingly, we had to update and tailor the information more towards what was going on in the world. We already knew how important vaccination was already for chronic disease patients and the rest of the community. The overall objective of the project is to provide means towards increasing the vaccination coverage of such patients by increasing their uptake of the vaccines. More specifically, the project aims to provide patients with chronic diseases as well as healthcare professionals and supporting communities, so targeting 3 different groups, with tailored information about the vital importance of vaccines in their specific context. We use the pilot project to address 2 specific diseases and general topic. The 2 specific diseases that we're covering includes the diabetes and respiratory diseases. So just so you know a bit of a background there. More specifically, the project aims to provide patients with chronic diseases, as well as the healthcare professionals, with tailored information about the importance of vaccination, but also improving their confidence in vaccines and empowering them to make the best possible decisions. So we were promoting as well shared decision-making and informed choice. As part of the backpack activities, we coordinated this year, the beginning of this year, 3 regional workshops to enable us to engage and work with representatives, which covers the healthcare communities, the patients, and as such at national levels across Europe. We tried to cover Central, Eastern, Southern, and Western Europe through 3 regional workshops. The workshops were the first patient-led and focused health event on vaccination of its kind held in Europe. The 3 workshops took place over the course of February to March of this year and gathered over 120 participants with balanced representation of healthcare professionals, patients, and supporting communities. We wanted to have everybody on the same table discussing together and not work in silos. We had the European Commission, the European Medicines Agency, and various vaccination and communication experts from across Europe who also had joined the discussion. Each workshop was designed following the principle of active engagement with plenary and parallel group sessions, enabling interactive debate while focusing on concrete and workable outputs and recommendations for the project, which is actually ending by the 30th of August. So we will have everything launched in September, and you will have everything that we've been working on online. This will include an advanced toolkit, as well as an e-learning resource and the website, obviously. There are 3 focus groups at each of these workshops that work towards refining the content of this backpacked advanced toolkit and its overall validation. So it's been tested and retested over the past year and a half, paving the way for effective dissemination to patients, healthcare professionals, and supporting communities at national and regional levels. We didn't create material targeted only at healthcare professionals or material targeted only at patients. We try to provide material that addresses the concerns or tries to address concerns of the patients, but also keeping the healthcare professionals updated and making sure they take into consideration informed decision and shared decision making. With the release and the authorization, so I'm going to go to more recent update, with the release and authorization of several COVID-19 vaccines over the past few months, there are still several questions that patients and civil societies need to be answered, obviously. As the leading voice of patient organizations in Europe, EPF also decided to use its expertise and leverage its network to host 2 informative sessions with high-level experts and provide crucial answers regarding COVID-19 vaccine. So we held 2 events called Shot Callers, Part 1 and Part 2. One was held in January of this year, and the second one was just held last month. A series of short video clips of some of the Q&As addressed as part of these events are freely accessible online.
And that's at the EPF website?
Yes, exactly.
I'd like to jump in here quickly. What you're talking about is that you're disseminating quote unquote trusted information. So you're trying to become a platform. How are you vetting the information? Sort of taking this back to the fake news premise, the thesis of the session today. How are you vetting that information to determine what is trusted, given the fact that even some of the governments have been changing their positions? How do you manage to work through that?
Well, we obviously have been trying to use as well. The WHO has recently been trying to make sure, the WHO, the ECDC, trying to make sure that we navigate misinformation and disinformation in quite an effective manner. So whenever we were trying to think of how we are going to navigate this, we always were thinking, if you're sharing, how does that make a person feel? Why is that person sharing? Do they know it's true? Where did it come from? Whose agenda might they be supporting by sharing this information? So there are several steps that had been discussed through best practices on how to deal when misinformation, from assessing the source of the misinformation to going beyond the headlines, identifying authors, checking the dates, examining supporting evidence, checking biases, turning on fact checkers, and as such.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Isabel. Now, taking that position, I'm now going to go to Wilfred here. And obviously, Wilfred, this has been a core part of your research, is rhetoric versus reality around some of these very heated political issues, and this is your specialty. From your perspective, you've obviously done a lot of analytical work as well as political work on this space. Can you just give us your perspectives about how do you decipher what's fake and what's not, given a lot of the times it's coming from supposedly authoritative sources?
Sure. Making sure my mic is on. So hello to all. As I said before, great to be here. And the focus of my talk today is COVID-19 and the response to COVID-19 in sort of the golden age of misinformation. So I'm a political scientist and a methodology professor rather than a doctor. So I'll present a small amount of medical information, but mostly leave that to the pros. I'm going to talk primarily about information confusion in general, how that has really complicated the COVID response, and briefly about what leaders can do from this point forward re-COVID-19, and more importantly, do the next time around. So I'm the author of the books Taboo and Hate Crime Hoax. And as the host noted, a major professional focus of mine is testing widely made claims in the social sciences in particular. For example, the idea that quote unquote white privilege is widespread with social class adjusted for, or that diverse societies in racial terms have trouble functioning, to see if they are true, if they are based in fact. And very often what I find is that many things that are very widely believed and that are very, very influential from a public policy and leadership level policy standpoint have almost no basis in fact. Without giving a history lesson, this tendency toward media-driven misinformation is something that's long been studied by quants in psychology, politics, sometimes sociology, dating back at least to Barry Glassner's The Culture of Fear in 1999 and the actual papers that underlay that. And Glassner, who is a sociologist by background, if I recall correctly, took a look at some of the classic bugaboos of his time. The coming middle-class heterosexual AIDS epidemic, plane crashes, animal attacks, and in particular, young child kidnapping, which was an epidemic fear among American women at this time because of competition between the cable networks. People were walking around with small children on leashes and this kind of thing. And what Glassner found was that almost all of these fears, quite empirically, were based in misinformation. Most specifically, and we see this today, the repetition of single individual cases over and over by the networks, which created what he called an illusion of typicality, a phrase that's still useful today as we move into this topic. But after a brief lull, this sort of panic now seems to be back in fashion. So researching movements like Black Lives Matter for Taboo, and more recently for a couple of academic articles, I found that people overestimate things like police violence and racial conflict to a fairly remarkable degree. I'm going to get directly into COVID in about 30 seconds, but it's worth detailing a bit of this. There was a well-done large-in study recently from the Skeptic Research Center, which found that something like 33% of people who identify as very liberal, quote unquote, believe that the average number of specifically unarmed, specifically Black men killed annually by American police is about 1,000, quote unquote. Another 14 to 15% believe that that figure is about 10,000. And more than 7% of all of the respondents thought that the figure would be more than that. It would be above a baseline of 10,000. Among standard liberals, which is to say not leftists, but anyone over the center of a typical political through line, in that group, the same figures were, if I recall correctly, 26% believed the annual total is about 1,000. 6% believed it was about 10,000, and 7% believed it was more than that. And conservatives, I'm not going to go through all 6 categories, but conservatives didn't do much better. This study didn't stand alone, for that matter. Another study called The Social Construction of Racism by my fellow political scientist Eric Kaufman found that 80% of Blacks and 60% of educated white liberals believe, at least in the USA, that young Black men are more likely to be shot by the police than to die in car wrecks. So to put this in context, the total number of unarmed Black men killed by police officers in the most recent year on record, 2020, was actually 18. Less than 250 Black people total were shot and killed by police. Only 1,021 people of all races were killed by police in the year. So in contrast, there are up to 50,000 automobile wreck deaths in a typical year on US highways. And those are obviously concentrated among young men of all races. We also have a gun problem in this country. There are 15 to 20,000 homicides. So the number of people that at least 15 to 20% of these respondents thought were murdered by police in a year, 10,000 or more, is about on par with the total actual number of murders across all sexes, ages, and races. We see this sort of misinformation in a dozen or more other settings in today's media environment, where you have MSNBC going up against, until recently, the Rush Limbaugh program, so on down the line. Interracial crime tends to be wildly overestimated by people of all backgrounds. The person most likely to kill you is, in fact, your ex-wife if you're a male. And we've very much seen it in the context of COVID. And this is true to a remarkable extent. So perhaps most notably, the international consulting brand Keksta, if I have that correct, KEKS-CNC, found that the average American, at least within their randomized sample of 1,000 or more people, believes that 9% of the population so far has died from COVID-19. You can find this astonishing professional report. It's now publicly available just by Googling the name of the company and COVID opinion tracker. And I will note that Americans were not alone in our panic. The equivalent estimates were 7% for the UK, 3+% for Denmark, for the Danes, 5% for France, and so on right down the line. For the USA, and I believe overall, the overestimation of death numbers and death rates was on the order of 225x, or I suppose that would be 22,500%. Another study, which we talked about in the pre-discussion, but recently called out by the comedian and social commentator Bill Maher, of all people, on his television program, found that on average, Americans believe, either all Americans or all those who lean left, believed that 50% of the individuals infected with COVID-19 are hospitalized or sent to the ER. If I recall correctly, the actual figure was around 3%. So obviously, the element of salacious fear that we see with a lot of data like this has to do at least partly with media sensationalism. But the flow of wrong information about COVID had many fathers, as the old saying goes. It's fair to say that senior leaders, especially in the USA, did a very bad job of getting correct information out there. So throughout the pandemic, there was a torrent of misinformation and confused messaging. And I think we're talking today about how to avoid this to a much greater degree than even those desperate early circumstances made necessary. So an example of this would be the constantly changing messaging on masks, with Dr. Anthony Fauci saying early on that there is no, and frankly, this may be true, that there is no real medical reason to wear a mask other than a well-cut N95. He later admitted that that may have been something close to a noble lie, designed to reserve the more effective masks for healthcare workers. Both of these statements were made on primetime television, which didn't reduce the confusion here. There was very mixed messaging on lockdowns. So you had a range of states, the Dakotas, Iowa, Arkansas, Oklahoma, that never really locked down at all. I actually wrote a paper on this topic comparing them to lockdown states. You had other major states like Florida and Texas refusing to do so during at least the second round of closures. So there was never a national policy of any kind. At one point, I believe within a 2-day period, 43 of these states released statements on their lockdown or their non-lockdown policy. So predictions about the potential risks of COVID-19 underlying all of this behavior were all over the place. We all remember Neil Ferguson of Imperial College famously estimating an IFR, not a CFR, of around 1%. A potential death toll of 2 million in the USA, 550,000 in Britain by, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but September of last year, at least in his worst case. The well-known tech executive Thomas Pueyo went a step further than that. He estimated an IFR, again, an IFR of 4%, a potential maximum death rate of 10 million in the USA. That argument, I will note, originally dropped on Medium or some similar site, but was read millions of times and again led to primetime appearances on networks like CNN. And as this back and forth indicates, it wasn't hard for smart people to notice early on that a lot of consensus predictions, quote unquote, the science, turned out to fairly obviously not be true. So, I mean, masks do apparently work to some extent, and that position changed in working time at the governmental level. There is very little evidence that lockdowns do work. The lockdown states overall had more COVID deaths and deaths per capita than the non-lockdown states. Major nations like Sweden and indeed Japan remained open during the whole crisis. Though virtually all of the initial estimates about things as basic as the IFR of the virus, which was finally pegged down as between 0.26 and 0.58%, looking at the CDC monthly estimates on the side of my screen, turned out to be wrong. At the same time, other information which was known was never effectively communicated. We've known since the first data rolled in from Italy that the average age of a COVID fatality is around 81, at least for males. But a massive amount of messaging here has centered on protecting the children. The one time I tabulated media content recently, about 3.5 weeks ago, it was the majority of coverage of COVID. Can we safely open the schools? It's worth noting that the total number of under 18 kids to die in America during the pandemic is less than 600. So as a result of this conflicted torrent of information, we've seen a mass movement of people, and this is very mappable, and I'm working on mapping it right now, but toward alternative sources of information. And I think it's fair to say that a great many of these are worse. I mean, you've seen the mass popularity of, for example, not intending to call him out, but Twitter feeds like Alex Berenson's, a great deal of vaccine advice coming from the intellectual dark web section of the internet, where conversations on the Joe Rogan show, and again, no problem with any of these people, but often turn toward what's the best health praxis for COVID. That's obviously not ideal. So how can this be avoided? The advice on point is easier said than done. It's absolutely critical, it turns out, looking at which states succeeded, to have competent leaders and to coherently communicate 3 points: the level of risk from the disease or any similar disease, who is most at risk, and the key things we can do to mitigate risk. And my hope from the political science or the social leadership front would be, let's hope there's still time for that messaging as read the vaccine. But that's what I have for now.
That's great, Wilfred. Thank you very much. Again, the floor is open for questions. Please submit your questions using the Q&A bar. We've had a couple questions come in. I'd like to invite Donald and Franco to come in as well. Great presentations from you too. Excellent. Thank you, Donald, for your framing. Wilfred, I'm going to come back to you with one thing. And this is a question we've got here as well that's just come in. Showing numbers, political perceptions. What are your conclusions? What's the message? Why? Cui bono? Who benefits? Why has this been happening? Is it simply a ratings game? Are they trying to keep people scared for media ratings, tweets, clicks? What do you think?
I do think that the media and social media means us, by the way. I mean, we're adult professionals in a seminar like this. So everyone in a leadership position has some responsibility role here. I've been thinking about this myself. But media and social media have a lot to answer for with this. Yeah, to some extent. I mean, I think if you look at any of the internal tapes that have ever come out during multiple lawsuits across CNN, across Fox, even things like Project Veritas releases, although you have to decide how seriously to take that. I mean, media executives will very often say, I mean, this is a numbers game. We find that people respond to certain content and we are going to produce and provide that content. I mean, at the upper end of this game, if you're talking about shareholders, like that is something that's going to intentionally be done. One of the CNN discussions, if I recall correctly, was a question about what the next COVID would be. I.e., are we going to, that's word on the tape. I mean, are we going to move toward climate change? Are we going back toward Russia as the enemy? So yeah, I think that there's a conscious desire to lure in eyes to these networks so that you can then buy the big truck and the penis pills and the things that are being sold, frankly.
Thank you, Wilfred.
Social media, it's a lower level.
Thank you, Wilfred. I'm going to go, Franco, I'd like to come to you. Well, from a practitioner's perspective, I mean, Wilfred's been throwing out red pills left and right here. What's your perspective on this?
Yes, well, I'm not a great expert in infectious diseases, but Wilfred has raised a couple of points which will recur in my talk, which moves on a slightly different plane of public policy and health anyway. The first issue regards, I quote a sentence probably you will see from a recent book I read with interest. Maybe you are aware of Lee McIntyre called Post-Truth, published a couple of years ago.
Yeah, the Post-Truth book, yes. Excellent.
Yeah, and in one statement, which applies very well to what COVID issue and to the issue I'm going to prepare, is the problem partly from the media outlet of the need for equal representation in debates, and particularly in debates about health or other issues of public interest. And the rule of equal representation has become a rule now in media, only succeeds, that I quote, in creating false equivalence between two sides of an issue, and therefore is polarizing issues, even when there is only one credible side. Now, I go back to the credibility so the responsibility of media outlets or any other influential organization that outreach the public rather than the scientists is what drives this need for equal representation and biasing the credibility that we then, on the other side, tend to receive, that the one is equal to one. Yeah. But in fact, in debates, you give the same weight to one representative of a side which has a very minority credibility compared to the majority, and you have one against one. And I wonder whether you find similarities in your field of work and how much that is an issue that needs to be addressed more clearly, because I see this very, very relevant to the confusion we have at the moment.
It's a really good point. Let me just throw a wrench in that, just for the sake of argument here. I'll play devil's advocate here, because if you remember, what your argument is sort of the Human Rights Commission of the United Nations, which has Saudi Arabia and Syria on it. Does that make it legit? And again, I totally get that. But if we're only relying, and I think the bigger issue here, which Wilfred is getting into, and I'm not going to speak for Wilfred, I'll come back to him, and also I want Isabel to chime in as well as Donald, if we look at, for example, January 17th, the WHO, supposedly the arbiter of taste in this issue, sent out a tweet saying that there was no evidence of human-to-human transfer of COVID-19. Now, that's supposed to be the mother of all authoritative sources. And they sent out arguably probably the worst tweet that could possibly have been sent out. You know, that if Trump would send that out, he would have been banned from social media. And this is the WHO. So how do we reconcile this fact that, yes, we do want reputable sources, but then when those reputable sources are just completely, totally, 100% wrong, how do we deal with that, Doctor?
Yeah, if you allow me to step in, because I said there were 2 points raised. In which
Sure, please.
This is my second, very briefly. Let's say there is a difference between, obviously, the speed with which COVID-19 has asked all of us, from scientists to public, to act is unprecedented. And time has been, for right or wrong, something has created some of the distortions. Because usually science is slower. You think, you check, and you confirm, and we haven't had the time. But I just want to raise one issue. The lack of evidence of effect is not equivalent to evidence of no effect.
Right.
And in fact, in the mask story, at the time the statement was made, there was no study. The rush came immediately. The studies were done, they were simple, easy to do, and the evidence was provided that they did work. And some effects were quantified in terms of distancing allows for 20% reductions, the use of the mask, more layers, you put another 20. And if you don't touch, you're at 2 meters, it's an extra 20%. It doesn't solve the problem. And it's interesting that, at least in Britain, during the pandemic, if you isolate the epidemic of flu, did not exist last year.
Yeah.
We didn't have an epidemic of flu bronchitis because we were wearing masks, we're getting distance, and all communicable disease through airborne disease were prevented, not just COVID.
Sure. Thank you very much, Doctor. Donald, from your perspective, how are you dealing with this as a practitioner and a thought leader? You've got to weed through this stuff. How do you do it? And you're muted, by the way.
Thank you, Dwayne, and thank you very much, Wilfred. You're raising a number of key points. I think today we're really focusing on fake news in the context of vaccines. And I think that there's a lot of debate around or uncertainty about data, and some countries don't record as much. And in more recent times, people who initially were more worried about the disease, they would rush to get tested. That inflates the figures. I think we've got some uncertainties. But what we do seem to see is we're now beginning to get into the stage of big data and trying to be more systematic, more logical, and getting registries. And these registries are showing that of those who get COVID, enough at least to get a hospital, and that's not everyone, there's 1 in 9 appear to be getting some kind of longer term COVID. Now you're then into, what does that mean? Well, some of it is really objective. They've got scarring in their lungs, they're having scans, they may have some heart failure. It's really objective. At the severe end also, there's various clotting disorders with the virus. There's various multiple sclerosis-like syndromes with the virus. You can show white plaques in the brain. You can't get away from that. At the other end of the spectrum, you have the neuropsychiatric effects. And there's lots of reasons to be depressed, anxious after an illness. And maybe you lost your job, and maybe there's a family member died, it may be you. So not all these are easy to pin down. Now we're still, however, getting into more evidence. We're into being able to measure onto antibodies. Why is it happening? You react against the virus. You can show people with worse long COVID have these things. So irrespective of the total number of cases, undoubtedly we have a disease which not only causes deaths, it also causes long-term disease. So I think that's indisputable. And I think inside part of Isabel's problem, I suspect, with her patients is there's different categories. Some people deny the disease happens at all. Other people deny it's severe. Other people are very worried about what's in the vaccine and what's in it for them. And so I think there's lots of issues when it comes down to that. Maybe just one last point in terms of the evidence. A lot of evidence from the European Centre for Disease Control, the Atlanta CDC, other reputable organizations, Johns Hopkins, trying to get data. And they're beginning to be able to get a handle on excess mortality. So taking everything else into account, certainly in the very early stages of COVID, last Easter to 2020, every age group showed at least a 40% blip for all sorts of reasons. There's more inflammatory disease, there's more other things going on. also less, and that's a big issue. So I think undoubtedly we have a disease which probably worldwide may have a mortality of 2%. It's caused worldwide estimates at least 5 million excess deaths. In the USA, 574,000, 600,000 excess deaths.
Sure.
These are, I agree, a lot of them are old people, but look at old politicians. We've got our famous scientists. They're still productive. Just because you're 80 doesn't mean to say you're allowed to die. I think cutting through all this, I think we ought to be thinking, what is it about vaccines? What can we do to get the vaccine side discussed and trying to get safe information and patients trusting this is the thing to do. And as you say, Isabel, getting health professionals confident as well as patients confident.
So Isabel, from your perspective, for example, when Emmanuel Macron came out and was quite hostile towards the AstraZeneca vaccine, how would the EPF deal with something like that? How would you actually deal with the controversies around the AstraZeneca vaccine?
I mean, we have several articles online targeting, this ongoing debate, specifically addressed to our members. I mean, a year into the pandemic, vaccines are being rolled out and information about them, some of them are reliable, some are not, and it's everywhere. What we try to advocate for is public trust in science, and evidence is essential for overcoming COVID-19. Therefore, finding solutions to this infodemic is vital for saving the lives from COVID-19 as public health measures, specifically like mask wearing, hand hygiene, and as such. In regards to the vaccine itself, we held these several workshops where we had experts discussing and addressing the concerns of the patients. What we suggest and what we always recommend is to follow the advice of your public health institutions and your authorities and the websites relevant to the EU and the international organizations, including the ECDC and the WHO. And this, by this way, you can help by not sharing unverified information that comes from dubious sources. Because if you're commenting, no matter if it's positive or negative, the sharing, in fact, increases the chance of that article or of that video to be posted online or viewed with improve, the availability online. So that way, we need to just ignore it, move forward, check the trusted informational sites, and discuss. Research is ongoing. I mean, this is an unprecedented time, and we need to trust in health professionals. What the problem is as well is that there is lack of trust as well in healthcare professionals themselves. So when a healthcare professional doesn't have a trust in vaccination uptake and does not recommend it to his patients, that's when we have a problem, because we're having contradictory information available out there. And the thing is, scientific organizations and institutions need to come up with a strong rebuttal to such comments. And as such, that's from my side.
Sure. And Donald, if I'm not mistaken, 30% of health practitioners in the UK have not had the vaccine. Is that correct? Is that the data I'm hearing? Isabel shaking her head. I think I'm close.
I'd be very surprised if that's the case. I think it depends what you mean by health professionals.
Well, not nursing practitioners and the nursing staff, from what we're hearing.
There's a laissez-faire attitude. If you look at the care aspects, people in care homes, elderly people being cared for, the question is, can you force care home workers to be immunized? Right. So if you include those people into the percentages, then maybe it's quite high. I think if you look at people in acute settings, I'd be very surprised if most of them haven't already been immunized in the UK. And
again, ladies and gentlemen, we are taking your questions. Please, sorry, Donald.
Just to say a bit more about that, it's interesting how things evolve. So historically, if you want to work as a doctor or a nurse, you've got to be immunized against hepatitis B, hepatitis C. Yeah. You're going to have proof that you haven't got measles. You're going to give it to your patients. And I think we're at the evolving stage of a new vaccine, general uptake population, and should you force given sectors to have the vaccine? That's the stage we're at, I think. But I think Britain is pretty good in terms of other international comparisons of the acute services. I think in contrast, France is a lot more concern about professionals being reluctant themselves to be immunized and reluctant to give clear health messages, and that the reasons for that are complicated but important to unravel, because without that kind of encouragement, then it becomes very difficult for the population to accept a new vaccine.
There was some data in France that 70% of females reproductive age have not had the papillomavirus vaccination, HPV. 70%, some very high numbers. We got a great question here. I'd like to circulate to the panel. I was and am an Oxford AstraZeneca trial volunteer. I've watched the science closely. Why does someone like me despair of the media and government? Outside of science, we stumble on misinformation. Politicos and media cannot handle scientific data. Why? This is from James Gibson. James, thank you very much for your question. Why do politicos and media people stumble with data? Wilfred, this seems to be your wheelhouse. I'm going to come to you. What's going on here?
I mean, I think that the short answer would be, without seeming credentialist or professionalist, that a lot of them don't know what they're looking at. I mean, in the United States, something like 1/4 of the members of the Senate are biblical creationists. And obviously there's nothing wrong with a personal relationship with God, but if you're confronted with a log-lin regression model, you might not know what you're looking at. You might be inclined to fall back on heuristics. And I actually think, I mean, this ties into a couple of the fascinating points that were made as kind of the panel went around and talked about these issues. One question that was brought up that I think is absolutely critical for people to analyze is, how do you critique the elite or the professionals in a field? How do you call them wrong without creating an absurd false equivalence? I'm not sure I have an answer to this question. This is a very tough question. But I mean, in political science, using my own field, there are a number of things that are true. One of them is what you could call culturalism, that things like being given access to good schooling and then training, choosing to study, this will increase your chances of success in life. However, even this is not contested. There are also a large number of people that, not generally in political science, but they would identify as biological hereditarians. That Charles Murray recently released a book arguing for some pretty significant racial and national differences in IQ. On the other hand, you have what's sometimes called critical race theory, people that argue that any performance difference between groups is due to bigotry today or to the wars our ancestors fought against one another, this sort of thing. So both of these groups make some valid points against the mainstream paradigm, but do you choose to give all three of these perspectives the same amount of time at an academic conference? In general, in the discipline, we say no. But it's an interesting question. You have to be able to call people out for being wrong, but at the same time, you don't want nonsense. I mentioned, for example, early creationist theories of how the world came to be. Even if someone from that perspective has a very valid critique of evobiology, you might not want to give them the same amount of speaking time. What I think, basically, in a sentence, is that many politicians have a starting base of beliefs, of ideas that they come from, that they view as at least equivalently likely to be true as what they're hearing from science. In order to overcome these biases, I think it is absolutely critical that the scientific data being presented by my field or by the medical women and men or by anyone be correct and valid. And with COVID, because you're talking about a novel virus, things happened, as has been noted, so rapidly that a lot of what was said was pretty inconsistent, seemed pretty incoherent. And a lot of people just went back to, okay, then I'm going to do what I think is the case. And in the USA, we're a federalist country, last sentence. So I mean, we had everything from states that remained fully open. Governor Noem allowed the Sturgis motorcycle rally. And I mean, I lean toward the political right myself, but that was 200,000 people. And at the other end, I mean, there are cities that are still close to lockdown now, indoor masking and the like in California's metroplexes. So you get that kind of inconsistency when there's no one paradigm that anyone believes. The question is, how do you get the one accurate set of facts out there? Like I said, it's a tough question.
Donald, come back to you now, please.
Just in brief, to add to what Wilfred and Isabel have said, I think there's two sides to this mystery as to how there can be some really important study that's big enough and enough information is there where the message is blurred in some way. One is that the information should be trusted and clearly presented. But secondly, it's really important that our population and our presenters and policymakers understand what risk is and how to explain risk. And surveys, for example, have shown that there are many people out there who think that 3 in 100 is a bigger number than 2 in 10. And you've got to be able to explain risk, understand risk clearly. And that's something, it probably goes back to primary school, being able to explain the shares of a pie and what's risky behavior and how you explain risk to people, what's an acceptable risk.
Yeah, and if you look at some of the media communication around the Delta variant in the UK, you're finding that unfortunately, someone on media said, well, most of the deaths now are occurring in the pre-vaccinated, the already vaccinated. And so now you have this internet, and I've been on some of these chat rooms where people say, well, you're more likely to die if you're vaccinated, which is completely wrong. But unfortunately, this is how this stuff is getting out. Franco, did you want to comment quickly or?
Well, very quickly, I think I want to just link this discussion to the next talk. There may be
Sure.
different, and is really the one message which would be in terms of solutions. And I understand, well, I agree with Wilfred. What do we do about it? I think we have attempted with a group of friends, and I'll show it to you, to suggest a way forward. They are very radical, but obviously we need to start from being blunt in order then to try find a reasonable solution. Because if we are not blunt, we don't go anywhere. And the main thing is to maintain public trust in science and scientists and evidence, particularly for issues as big as the one we're debating now regarding public policies. It's not, and in medicine and in science and in public policy, beliefs doesn't find a place, in my view, personal view. Scientists have to follow evidence and not beliefs. And I'll try to raise the issue, and this is more looking at our navel, on why scientists disagree, which the public doesn't understand. And I think I will touch upon issues regarding us. Why do scientists disagree?
But
and
it's
why,
so,
and then create more damage, more harm than good sometimes. And we raise that issue.
But it's very important that they don't always agree, because that's how you get science. I get very concerned when I hear the science is settled.
We'll try to
list
in a case study on public policy, issues that lead to disagreement among scientists.
Sure.
Which are not science related.
No, we've just got a couple minutes before you're going to present your paper, Franco. Thank you. I'd just like to get some final comments from our excellent panelists today. Isabel, just final question for you. How do you determine fake news? How do you manage it? Any recommendations for people, given you've been communicating this now for the better part of 2 years around this issue? Any quick recommendations or quick wins you can suggest to people to avoid fake news?
I mean, if you're in Europe, there's the EU vaccination portal, which is an excellent portal that gives all of the trusted sources on it. But also you have the WHO website itself. There's several organizations such as ours, which are linking to theirs. We have our own COVID portal for chronic disease patients, where we try to link as well to those sources. The WHO has even a stamp for the trusted website sources. I'm hoping by the end of the month, I'm going to have the time to go through that and actually put it on our specific backpack pilot project. But otherwise, it's anyways a European Commission related European Union service contract, so it would be covered under that. But as long as you're looking at those type of websites, looking at the resources, checking who the author is, their background, going deeper than just a headline, reading further into it, listening to actually healthcare professionals. This is the only way. Just don't spread the misinformation.
Thank you, Isabel. And Wilfred, from your perspective, any clues or hints you can give to people or to how they should avoid being manipulated in some way?
The best tip that I can give people is, to some extent, do your own research. Move beyond the first veneer of media. Even listening to content like this wouldn't be a bad idea. I mean, there are numerous business and social scientific, medical scientific webinars live online every hour of the day. In terms of what I look at, the political science data I discussed regarding, for example, perceptions of police violence, interracial crime, the likelihood of the draft being reinstated. I mean, there are white papers from the government that come out once every 6 months breaking down all of these risks and what the actual numbers are. So, I mean, I would encourage people to go to the library or to get their computer out and to see what the facts are. One thing I would discourage people from doing is arguing with other random citizens about what those individuals' perceptions of the facts might be. If you read, if you're at a point where you can read scientific papers, and I think most people that would be really fascinated by this debate certainly could, once you look through the top 3 or 4 on the actual risk of COVID, I mean, there are multiple papers out looking at the question of do masks work, the Danish study and so on. Once you look through those, you could come to a logical conclusion. My conclusion is, of course, they do to some small extent, but you could come to that conclusion. You could assume that they certainly do if you're trying to protect others. You could perhaps say no from 1 or 2 of the papers, but you'd be basing that on your analysis of the best real information out there, rather than talking to other apprentices, kind of, if you will, about their perspective on that data. So I'd encourage people to go crack a book and see what the facts are. And in most fields, you can do that.
Thank you, Wilfred. Isabel, thank you very much. This concludes the first part of our discussion, and now Franco and Donald Singer are going to have a presentation of the paper, and I turn the table over to you, Donald, and thank Wilfred and Isabel for their participation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dwayne, and thank you, Wilfred and Isabel. What we're going to do now for our final discussion is we're going to turn to Professor Franco Capuccio, who is Professor of Cardiovascular Medicine and Epidemiology at the University of Warwick in the UK. Franco is a distinguished academic clinician. He's recent past president of the British and Irish Hypertension Society. He's also a consultant to the WHO on a number of key health issues. And Franco is going to turn to a topic which really touches on the responsibility of academics and the press to make sure our data is trusted. So over to you to discuss non-scientific threats in public health policies from regard to nutrition and reducing dietary sodium. Over to you, Franco.
Thank you very much, Donald. I'm turning slightly the attention to from the very topical COVID-19 issue, which is global and is acute. It's an infectious disease, it's killing rapidly millions of people. And try to find a solution into what is less perceived to be of vital importance. That is the prevention of chronic disease, the conditions that kill millions of people around the world, but slowly and steadily. Now, this talk I put together representing the content of a paper we just published is below. I can circulate for those who are interested. It's called Dietary Sodium Controversy, Issues and Potential Solutions. And I want to very briefly address the content of this as just to open up a discussion, rather, I don't want to use the word debate, a discussion on trying to gain more input from all of you. Let me just click next. I can just do, yeah. This is next. Okay. Well, this is our declaration of interest of the 4 authors. These are my colleague from Calgary in Australia, in Canada, and my 2 colleagues from Barts in London. Now, for those who are not familiar, I will set very briefly in a few slides the background, the health background of what I'm talking about, without going into great detail. First of all, high sodium intake, which is the substance contained in salt, is, by your surprise perhaps, the leading dietary risk for death globally. To high sodium intake is attributed more than 1.8 million deaths a year, and in excess of 45 million DALYs, which are adjusted life years lost globally, and this is an estimate of 2019. And why is that? Because high sodium intake chronically, day by day, increases your blood pressure. Now, high blood pressure over a certain point sometimes is referred to as hypertension in the clinical field, and by surprise to many, is the first cause of cardiovascular disease. Cardiovascular disease includes attacks, strokes, renal failure, heart failure, and other vascular conditions. Now, we've known for many, many years that if we reduce high blood pressure, we reduce the risk of death, of morbidity and disability from cardiovascular disease. And that's why millions of people in the world take blood pressure tablets to lower their blood pressure so as to save them from premature heart disease and strokes. Now, it is of interest because of the effect of sodium on blood pressure, a reduction in the amount of sodium we eat, at least in the range that we found in human beings, lower blood pressure has been shown, but also lower cardiovascular disease and reduces total mortality. And this has been known for about 40 years, and I'll show you very, very few data on that, so that global health organizations, including WHO, supports public health policy to reduce sodium consumption in populations to help prevent cardiovascular disease. And this is now one of the 7 targets for the Millennium Goals to reduce sodium consumption by 30% by 2025, aiming at finally a 2 grams of sodium per day or 5 grams of salt per day. So where is the evidence? So the consensus being for 40 years, coming from clinical trials of reducing sodium in relation to the effect on blood pressure levels. And this is a summary slide, including for each study here. These are meta-analyses, they're not individual studies. Each of these lines is a pooling project of several randomized trials reducing salt, looking at the effect on blood pressure. So as you can see, a variety of meta-analysis, including studies carried out in people with normal blood pressure, in people with high blood pressure, or in mixed groups. And each one collectively as a group reported a positive effect in reducing blood pressure by reducing sodium consumption. And for those who want to do a bit of statistics, the confidence intervals, the variability is inclusive in each one. So each of these estimates are compatible with each other statistically. In other words, they are allowing for the role of chance. So reducing sodium reduces blood pressure. Now, here, in fact, these are studies from observational epidemiology, taking long cohorts of people and following them up for a long time and seeing how much the sodium estimated at baseline in terms of consumption is associated with the long-term outcomes from both cardiovascular disease or total mortality. Sodium intake in this particular studies, these studies were measured by the gold standard measures of 24-hour urine collections, measuring the sodium you put out in the urine in 24 hours, which is a marker of how much you eat. As you can see here, there is a graded relationship here and here, both for cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality. The higher your sodium intake, the greater is your risk of dying of cardiovascular disease, dying overall. Not being content, randomized clinical trials are the gold standard to prove causality of effect. And this is a slide recently summarized by the US National Academy of Sciences, of Medicine, Science, and Engineering, a very highly reputable organization that's looked at all the data which report the randomized trials of sodium reduction and the effect on cardiovascular outcomes. There are very few studies, very difficult to do, which confirm a 30% reduction in the risk of dying for a difference in sodium intake from 4,000 to 2,000 milligrams per day. So the lower, if you reduce sodium, you cause a reduction in cardiovascular mortality. So it seems everything is fine. The problem arises now, excuse me, that in the last about 10 years, a controversy has been put forward, challenging the dogma, as they say, that sodium is, low sodium is good for you. And this is based on one of these presentations here, these studies. I published in a highly reputable journal that reducing sodium intake will increase the risk of death, particularly in the range from 4 to 2, which one I've just showed you by randomized trials, prove that reduces sodium, reduces blood pressure. So that they claim that the policy, the public policy should be halted, and there's been representation of WHO to stop policies globally. Now, why is that the case? Very, very briefly, there have been a number of perusal of the scientific evidence provided by these groups of dissenting scientists, as I call them, mainly based on a couple of big problems. The concerns about the advocacy against reducing dietary soap is based fundamentally on inappropriate research methodology and unrigorous research, with the low quality of data using the wrong method of measuring sodium intake by just taking a spot of urine and just one drop of urine. That clearly shows in this graph is a bias estimate of intake. So at the low level, they overestimate, the low level, they underestimate the real intake of sodium. And when they plot it for mortality in those studies, is create a spurious association with a J-shaped curve, which is not present if you use 24-hour urine collections. And these formulas to estimate have been highly challenged and really dissected in details. And nevertheless, these studies continue being published and referred to. So despite the low quality, there are numerous and often high impact journals, mostly by a group of close scientists, which are recruiting other views and featuring editorials, which are often with undeclared conflict of interest, which perpetuate and reproduce and continue publishing these studies and other studies with the wrong methodology, which is extensively being criticized in science, in writing. So we, as a group of scientists concerned about this, have started trying to understand why, and we have taken several actions, which I'm going to summarize very briefly. And we've listed our concerns by groups. For instance, and these are based on our personal experience and what you can call some anecdotes in terms of evidence. For instance, we have taken action some time ago in contrasting the Journal of Academy of Clinical Nutrition in the States, who published a supplement on sodium with all articles perpetrating a criticism against reducing sodium, funded by industry, where participants were advisors and consultants for food industry, when no disclosures were provided. Some of us wrote extensively to the editors, and although the omissions or journal policies were identified and notified to editors, no corrective action by the journal or disclosure was taken until 2013. And these are the articles. And just mind you, this is still being quoted despite all these arguments. The other problem that we find is in studies of public policy of interest, usually and mostly funded by public bodies, the replication of data is paramount. Some database of these studies, which claim adverse effects, are not publicly available, although they're mostly publicly funded. We are finding very difficult at the moment to obtain access independently to this data with refusal from the original authors, not trusting, of course, a verification of their analyses. In some cases in the past, things did happen, and by independent verification, the results were corrected. And in one instance, for instance, a standard formula here, which inflated the data, proved to be wrong once was tested. So there are examples where independent verification reinforces the credibility of the scientific community to the claims on the data. Well, we also refer to scientific and professional conduct. Obviously, we do believe and we trust responsible science, which relies in granting agencies, reviewing grant applications and providing money for studies, scientific and ethical review process, to peruse the appropriateness of the research methodology before granting money and allowing studies to progress. Furthermore, for those who are not familiar with that, anything you want to do on the study data should be declared upfront and not post hoc. And there is there is case, particularly in the scenario I'm referring to, of several post-hoc secondary analyses, which were not originally planned or reviewed, which have raised the controversy. There is one instance, for instance, where journals have delayed investigating overt claims made by some of us of concerns about papers published. And the retraction was grossly delayed. And once occurred, as in this example, we found that some authors still quote that study as an evidence. And it only comes to my mind disastrous examples of Wakefield and MMR cases that most of you will know, and how much damage that's done it. So this falls under the same category. Finally, we have identified faults and concerns among journals, granting agencies, research and ethics committee, where very often the flawed evidence is used and reused and republished, creating an aura of controversy and encouraging polarizations, when in fact they're all based on methodology that have been proven scientifically, at least challenged in science, to be wrong. Finally, we got the health and scientific organizations. I mentioned the false sense of equipoise and the credibility. The more you give space and platforms to dissenting scientists basing on low quality research their claims, you create an aura of controversy, and you also provide a platform of credibility, giving the impression of equal representations. And that's the point I was going to raise earlier on, that the problem is among scientists, because the two sides are both on paper credible scientists. And it's very, very difficult to dissect out who's right, who's wrong. Governments, sometimes I won't have to say that, it's obvious they're complacent about threats to evidence-based public policy. There are vested interests, there are lobbying against policy implementations and might concern business and other political beliefs. So what is the action? I think we feel very strongly that we are at the turning point, at least in nutritional science, where there is long-standing lack of ethical guidance, and we refer to all stakeholders. I mentioned earlier on the media, but we start from the granting bodies, we start from scientists themselves, to the editors, to the publishers and everyone. Now, why is that important? Well, we need not to forget, many millions of lives at stake here for reducing sodium, which seems such a trivial thing. And the guidance and standards of acceptable and unacceptable conduct is therefore needed. Academic organizations, for instance, should strengthen guidelines. Funding bodies should seek more rigorous design and methods. And editors sometimes have been negligent in publishing quality research. So in conclusion, we discuss the experiences and observations that relate to undermining the evidence supporting a moderate reduction in dietary sodium as a public health policy. We report the concerns that plague science, in our view, even outside the health field. And I just want to refer to climate change, where there are very similar actions are happening. And I want just to refer to what has happened in the similar matters in the past on tobacco smoking and health. We raise issues that are critical for society to address, and I said, if anything, to maintain public trust in science. We share with many scientists the desire to discover the true relationship between sodium intake and health outcomes, particularly given that millions of lives are at risk. But we all play a role in safeguarding science. So I think we need to collaborate, and we believe we need to include ethics group to develop, implement, and enforce higher standards to safeguard public policy. Thank you.
Franco, thank you very much indeed for a very clear presentation, a very worrying presentation on a number of counts. It really calls into question the ethics of academic researchers, but also the journals themselves. I suppose two obvious initial questions while our audience may be coming in. What have you been able to do? You've tried to address it through correspondence in the journals. What have you been able to do outside, or what other steps do you think are practical to try to address this? Because clearly it's a very difficult, long-standing issue going on here.
Okay, I think on this we've been working in a large group, in part individual, in part collectively, for many years, as you probably know, and there've been some successes like retraction of papers. The problem is still unclear for most of us why some scientists take so much credibility on the basis of science, because it's very difficult to differentiate we stick to the criticism of science, and there is a risk among scientists to fall into the trap of personalizing the criticism. Because at the end of the day, there are always some leaders and some followers. So I would like to stay away from identifying any particular individual scientist, because over the last 20 years, 15 years of this descent, many have joined in and have come and gone, and the funding behind, the conflict of interest behind, have moved and changed with the world. First was industry and personal conflict of interest and pay, basically. And then came organizations, the race for funding and for accumulation of larger bodies of funding collectively, because the larger studies is considered to be better. And the argument that we have raised and proven in written papers all over again, the larger doesn't mean better, because if you have an error in your method, a larger study will produce a larger error. And this is where we are sticking to criticizing, and I don't go into the details, the technical details of the criticism, but they're all highly published. The problem is the denial of the other side. If you read papers that portray that sodium reduction is bad, none of the evidence that we have reportedly there is quoted. So we see his responsibility in the journals, in the peer review process, is a failure in the editorials, in failure in the granting bodies, is all over. And why is that? Don't ask me why. The why is very difficult. But definitely this is picked up as in the media as a great headline, say, low salt kills you. Don't do it. And that's where we come into the media and the need to sensation, readership, and searching for quality of evidence. How does a media or a journalist ascertains the level of credibility? I heard what Isabella said, but it's very difficult, or even Wilfred, for a lay person to read and find out. When we say, is a vaccine good or not, you read. How many of lay people have knowledge of how a vaccine works and how it develops and what the side effects are? We're asking lay people to have degrees and knowledge that sometimes among scientists we call.
The way you're at a different level here, you're talking about the professional journals. They should have a professional editorial team. They should have probity in the reviewers. So you'd have thought that would help. I mean, the other obvious point is, it is disappointing.
They have policies. They have policies. They all breach their policies.
But it's disappointing that these papers get through what should be a robust review process. And if you see what happens in the media, if there's an incorrect article published, they may have a retraction, but usually it's buried on page 26. So even if you get a letter published, it's not always given the space it should be. An obvious comment and related question: if this sort of thing happens in the public, your washing machine fails or something happens, or the building does something wrong, there is some ombudsman in the UK and similar in other countries to try to help you resolve this. Now, I'm not sure if our attendees are aware of this, but there is a committee called the Committee on Publication Ethics. And the whole point of this is to make sure that you don't get false authorship, you don't get issues with how articles are published, bias not being picked up or not being recognized. The challenge there is of course, this committee is made up of editors and publishers, one or two other individuals and organizations. But I'd have thought it's an obvious body at least to approach, and if they're unable to deal with it, then that itself raises the question about should there be some body independent of the journals, which can somehow be a right of address to make sure if this thing happens, you can't address in the normal way, you deal with that.
Yeah, I think that's correct. In part, it's correct. There are bodies, and I think each journal's got the ethical guidelines, and we have raised issues of some of the big ones, and they go through a process, an internal process, and as you know, is an inquiry amongst yourselves. So you judge yourself, so you have no independence. And if you had any interest in publishing that in the first place, you're not going to have any interest in then retracting it later. The point you're saying is collaborating across the board with less vested experts, and I think we are moving towards the ethicists and people expert in medical ethics, but not necessarily in salt reduction or cardiovascular or any other, and in the hope that could be more unbiased. And also we are engaging with lawyers, medical lawyers, academic lawyers, in cases where there could be a breach of things that be relevant. There have been cases where it's not our case for now, but because we don't want to polarize at the individual level, where organizations hosting particular scientists have been notified of potential concerns. Now, can you imagine nowadays, at least in Britain, but I think I hope everywhere in the world, we cannot get money from the tobacco industry. Okay, so that's fine. I cannot get a grant for tobacco industry. If I do, I need to declare it. Probably my institution has a right to stop me from getting the money. That is a great success, but for nutrition, there isn't any of that. You can do a study saying that Coca-Cola is good for you and save your life and for kids, and there's nothing you can do. Now, for sodium, we're reaching the point of for sugar. Is the same. We're reaching the point that driving epidemics in the world, and still they are not considered at the same level. And you can even argue that it's not harmful.
As a final question, there's two elements. One is public uncertainty. The journalists pick up on this, and the journalists love to have conflict, and it gives them good headlines. But more fundamentally, the question is, are these publications having an adverse impact on what should be good public health strategy? And are bodies such as the WHO aware of the bias, or are they susceptible to the information coming out here?
Well, I can tell you that I'm happy about the WHO to continue their program. And there's also another big organization now funded by the Bill Gates and Melinda Foundation and Bloomberg. It's called Resolve to Save Lives. And they are fully committed to the prevention of cardiovascular disease through salt reduction and blood pressure control. And they are moving on irrespective of that. But this is what we call a spanner in the wheel continuously, because there have been continuous rumors to shake the certainty of those who operate in the field, which are not always very, very tight scientists as we are in this field, but they are the next level of public health. The policymakers are not always very technical, and they rely on people like us. And when they are challenged, they become shaky in their political decisions. They can be criticized by then the political side. And there's always a politics in there. Now, making a decision to reduce salt at the country level needs a very strong representation from science to persuade a usually reluctant political side to implement, as you know. It's been for tobacco, it's been for sugar, it's been for fat, trans fatty acids, it's been for sodium, and so forth. So when you shake the certainty on science, you shake the political determination to continue. So it is a problem.
Well, on that key point, Franco Capuccio, thank you very much indeed for raising these key issues. I'd like to close the session by thanking all our panelists today, to thank our attendees from around the world for taking part in this. And if I could just share my screen briefly, just to highlight what's coming up in these future sessions, do join us. We will send you an email so you can be kept up to date with what's coming up and who's speaking. I share my screen. Here we go. You can see that the next session is coming up at the end of August on AI, what it can do for us in the homes and hospitals. And the further sessions coming up in September on equity outcomes. What about international equity in terms of geopolitics and price of medicines? And lastly, in the month when we have the International Climate Change Forum in the UK, what about climate and health, and why should we be concerned? So on that note, thank you all very much.